Sing praise, sing praise. Forever God is faithful, forever God is strong, forever God is with us, forever and ever, forever.
We often joke about what will happen at the pearly gates. If Jesus' teaching about the sheep and goats in Matthew 25, verses 31 to 46 is to be believed, the entrance requirements into the kingdom of heaven will have as much to do with how we have used our lives to serve the oppressed as it does with anything else. Justin Guin teaches part-time at HCU and serves as a youth minister in Double Springs, Alabama. In this lesson, he reminds us about the necessity of serving others.
Our parable under consideration for this lesson is Matthew chapter 25, verses 31 to 46. If you want to be turning to that passage, we'll be there momentarily as we will consider the parable of the sheep and the goats. One night, a lady had a dream that she had a direct one-on-one conversation with God directly in His presence. And she was quite frustrated with some things going on in her life. She was frustrated because she saw all the evil and the suffering that were going on with people around them and the world at large. And she noticed people in third world countries who were dying because of starvation, and they didn't have the basic provisions of life. And she noticed some incidences in her friends' lives where people were suffering because of death and disease and different maladies in their life were causing them to be discouraged and despondent in life. And it just pent up some frustration with her. And so she looks at God in her frustration. She says, God, do you not see the hurt that is going on with your people and in your creation? God, what are you going to do about this situation? To which God gently replied, I have done something about it. I have created you. We'll learn here in Matthew chapter 25 that the church is characterized by service. And to get the broader context, let's begin in Matthew chapter 24, verses 1 and 2, and we'll see a couple of questions that the apostles asked Jesus based upon some things he says about the temple and his second coming. So let's begin in Matthew chapter 24, and we're going to look at verses 1 and 2. It says, And Jesus left the temple, and he was going away when his disciples came out to point to him the buildings of the temple. But he answered them and he said, You see all these things, do you? Truly I say to you, there will not be one stone left upon another. In verse 3 he says, And he sat upon the Mount of Olives, and his disciples came to him and asked him privately, saying, Tell us when these things will be, and what will be the sign of your coming at the end of the age. And Jesus begins to address both of these questions. First, he addresses the destruction of the temple. Can you imagine their response when Jesus looks at them and says, this great magnificent temple that's taken 46 years to rebuild, and in the present state that we have it, it's going to be destroyed. And Jesus explains that. At the end of this discussion, he answers the second question, when his second coming will be. And beginning in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 45, Jesus begins a series of parables that deal with preparation concerning the second coming. And you've studied some of these parables already, the parable of the wise and foolish virgin, the parable of talents, the parable of the wise servant there in Matthew chapter 24, starting in verse 45. And one principle that we see in all of these parables is preparation for judgment. A disciple lives with the future in view and making preparation for those things, and each one has its own emphasis. And that brings us to our parable under consideration in Matthew chapter 25 and verses 31 to 46, and the parable of the sheep and the goats. Now, when I preach and teach, I like to learn one principle. And if you don't get anything else out of this lesson, I want you to learn this one principle that you will learn here from Matthew chapter 25, verses 31 to 46. And that is this: the church must serve others as if serving Jesus himself. Let me repeat that. The church must serve others as if serving Jesus himself. And as we begin to break down this parable, you're going to see what we mean by that. And some of you, no doubt, are already familiar with this parable. And Jesus brings all of these parables to a climax with a judgment scene, and with the sheep and the sheep on the right hand, the goats on the left hand. And so let's begin noticing three things about this parable. The first thing we see is the separator, and that is the Son of Man. Beginning in verse 31, let's read this verse together. It says, when the Son of Man comes in his glory, and the angels with him, and he sits on his glorious throne. You will see different Old Testament images in this parable that would have been familiar to the Jewish mind. You see, first, the Son of Man image, taken from Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 and 14, where the Son of Man, the coming Messiah, is described as one who reigns upon the earth and rules over his people. Another image you're going to see here in the next few verses is the separation. You see the nation being brought before the glorious throne of the Son of Man. And you see in other prophetic passages like Isaiah chapter 2, where the judgment of the nations was reserved only for the Lord himself. And of course, you see the separation, as we'll notice, between the sheep and the goats. If you go to Ezekiel chapter 34, and you see the Lord is the one responsible for those separating them between the sheep and the goats. That's verse 37 of Ezekiel chapter 34. So you see the layers of Old Testament imagery as Jesus describes himself not only as the Messiah, the anointed one, but as God himself, for the responsibilities that were delegated to the Lord are given to the Son of Man. So you have the separator, Jesus, sitting on the glorious throne and judging the nations. The next, you have the separation. If you continue here in this passage, look at verse 32. And before him will be gathered all the nations, and he will separate the people as one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will place the sheep on his right hand and the goats on his left. And then the king will say to those on his right, come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom before the foundation of the world. Now we notice the separated. You see the first one. The image, the metaphor of the sheep and the goats is dropped here in verse 34, and Jesus begins to address the righteous and the unrighteous directly. So let's notice the righteous. Notice he says here, you have an inheritance. This inheritance in the Bible is described in many different ways. It says it's been prepared. It's undefiled. It's unfading, 1 Peter would tell us there in chapter 1. This inheritance that's been promised to you since before the foundation of the world, you come in and you enjoy your reward. Why are they deserving of such reward? Notice the reason here in verse 35, where Jesus says this.
For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me. In verse 37, they're confused. They say, Lord, when did we see you in this circumstance? When did we see you in such dire straits? And Jesus makes the statement here in verse 40, and the king answered them, truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these, my brothers, you did it to me. Simple acts of service. When they chose to make a difference in people's life, when they ministered to other people, they were demonstrating this declaration of righteousness that had been given to them by God the Father. And then he begins to address the unrighteous, known as the goats earlier in the passage rather. We see the goats, he looks at them, he says just the opposite. Verse 41, that he will say to those on the left, depart from me, you cursed, for eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. Notice the reason why. Verse 42, I was hungry, you gave me no food. I was thirsty, you gave me no drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me. I was naked, and you did not clothe me. Sick and in prison, and you did not visit me. And they answered the same way, Lord, when did we see you in such a destitute circumstance? It says, when you chose to neglect serving your fellow man, you neglected me. And you see the eternal separation there in verse 46, where the focus is not only on the here and now, but an eternal reward, eternal consequence, obviously eternal punishment for those who were neglectful, and eternal reward for the faithful. As we look at this parable, we see a challenge for the church to be described and characterized by their acts of service. And that's where we learn our principle. For me as a Christian and for you as God's people, we have to look at opportunities of serving, especially serving those who are of like faith. Paul would say in Galatians chapter 6 and verse 10, we do good to every person, especially the household of faith. The NRSV says something to the effect of, in verse 40, when you did it to the members of my family, you did it to me. When we serve mankind, especially those who are of like faith as we are, we serve Christ himself. Souls represent Jesus. Opportunities of service are opportunities to minister to people and make a difference in the world around me. Such is a great life, as we notice here, not only in the here and now, but also the future, having an inheritance that is prepared for us, but from before the foundation of the world. But we ask a question, why is the life of a servant great? And I want to notice three things with you that helps us understand the greatness of service. And how do I become a great servant? That may seem a bit like two contradictory principles. They're a great servant. A servant is someone who's humble and does what is needed. But how do I excel, maybe a better way to put it, in my serving the Lord? How do I do that? And there are three things I want you to consider. Number one, you got to ask the right questions. A servant asks the right questions. Now, what type of questions did these people ask? Well, think about it. What can I do for you? Are you hungry? What can I do to help you with this circumstance? When can I come see you? I know you're hurting. You need companionship. You need those types of things. What types of people were these? They were people that looked at opportunities and they made sure that the needs of other people were met. If somebody was hungry, they gave them food. If somebody was sick, they went and visited them. If they needed shelter, they put a roof over their heads. If they needed companionship, they made sure they had companionship. Never underestimate the power of Christian fellowship. You say, Justin, I don't have the means to, I can barely feed my family. I don't really have a place where I can put up people. What about just Christian fellowship? You were sick and in prison and you visited me. I was sick and in prison, you visited me. The idea of encouraging one another. Never underestimate the power of your relationship. And such a life is patterned after Jesus himself. Look at Mark chapter 10, the passage we're going to look at a couple of times in our lesson here in this first point. Mark chapter 10, beginning about verse 13, as we look at Jesus as an illustration and the example to which we follow. Mark chapter 10 stresses the service of Jesus, beginning at about verse 13 and really going throughout the whole chapter. And you see Jesus meeting the needs of other people. And two different times we see Jesus ask this question, what do you want me to do for you? James and John come at him with a request in Mark chapter 10, verse 36. What do you want me to do for you? Look down a little bit later in Mark chapter 10, verse 51. What do you want me to do for you? Is that the type of attitude that we have? Do we have a servant's heart that says, I'm here to serve and I'm here to do what you need me to do? Let's make application. A couple of passages in the New Testament come to mind when it comes to asking the right questions. What do you want me to do for you? And that's the challenge to the church in several different books, especially in the general epistles. If you look at a couple of passages, James chapter 2 and verses 15 and following, James is describing an active, vibrant faith. And it uses a scenario where someone comes into your assembly and they are in need of food and destitute of basic provision. And you look at them and say, my heart goes out to you. I hope that you get what you need. James asks the question, what good is that? Such is the attitude of the neglectful people, the unrighteous there in Matthew chapter 25. What good is that? What have you done to help that individual with their circumstance? What does James say? Well, we demonstrate that faith by showing our faith with our actions. We are people of action. In 1 John chapter 3 and verses 17 to 19, John would make this statement. But if someone has the world's goods and they see his brother lacking in daily provision, and you shut up your heart to that individual, how is the love of God being seen through you? And he makes a statement, let us not love in word only, but in deed and truth. You ask the right questions. What can I do for you? Because as the church, described as servants, we minister to others as if ministering to Jesus himself. And that's going to require some things of me as a Christian. One thing it's going to require me to do in the second place is I've got to get out of my comfort zone. What is your comfort zone? You think about how we go about our daily business. We have a routine that we get in. That's not necessarily a bad thing. When it comes to our faith, we go to the same Bible class that we've gone to for years and years and years. We sit on the exact same pew that we've sat on for years and years and years. We go eat the same places, maybe go see our family. We come back on Wednesdays, and we're involved maybe teaching Bible classes here. And all of these are good things, but those are things that are within our comfort zone. Are we stretching ourselves as it relates to serving other people as if they represent Jesus themselves? How uncomfortable would it make you to invite someone into your home and to provide a roof for them, a place to stay, to provide clothes for them? How much of a dent in your pocketbook would it be to help somebody out with some groceries and do those things that are needed to serve other people, such as following the example of Christ? I think about the example that Paul uses in relation to Christ in Philippians chapter 2. In Philippians chapter 2, in verses 3 and 4, he has been challenging the Philippian Christians to put aside these things that are causing some divisions. There's apparently some schisms between the members there. He says in verses 3 and 4 in that chapter, he says, you put others' interest before your own. Verse 5, he says, for such is the mind of Christ. Do you have the mind of Christ? The easy to read version in Philippians chapter 2 and verse 5 says, you live and you think like Jesus. And then he gives an example. And the example of Jesus that he uses is what we often refer to as the incarnation of Christ. And in this passage, Jesus is noted that he had equality with God. He did not hold on to that equality of God, those divine privileges that he enjoyed in the pre-incarnate state. He didn't hold on to those things. And Paul says there in verse 7 that he became a man. He, in the morphe, in the form of man, taking on the form of a servant. In verse 8, he says he was obedient to the point of death. And Paul adds this last little phrase there in Philippians chapter 2 and verse 8, and it's a point of emphasis, even death on a cross. You know, for you and me, a cross is a positive thing. We wear jewelry that has a cross on it because that means victory. Recently, in two different places, I noticed a gas station and a church building around where I work. They've erected those large white crosses, spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to erect a huge cross in a place of business and also a church building. Why is that? Because we look at the cross and we see it as a point of victory, but to a Roman mind, a cross was a marker of shame. Even death on a cross. What's meant by that? If you look at Mark chapter 10, in verse 34, we'll notice four things when it comes to Jesus' willingness to serve other people. In Mark chapter 10 and verse 34, he's been addressing his apostles again about service. And he foretells his coming sacrifice. And I want you to notice a few things about Jesus' willingness to serve as mankind, even to the point of death, as Paul would say, even death on a cross. In verse 34, if you can remember these four things that start with the letter S. First thing it says, they will mock him or they will scoff at him. Think about the crucifixion events and the ridicule that Jesus underwent for you and for me. A second thing he says, they will spit on him. How degrading is that to have someone spit in your face? Third thing, he says they will scourge him. They will slay him. That's what Paul meant, even death of a cross. Talk about getting out of your comfort zone. Do we have that sacrificial attitude of taking up my cross daily and serving my fellow man? When I think about getting out of your comfort zone and serving other people, I can't help think about my granddad. My granddad was involved in the jail ministry for years and years and years. One thing he did as a part of this ministry was that he would bring inmates home with him when they were released from jail. And when I was growing up, I thought that was a very odd thing to do because I was very young. But I look back, I admire his willingness to serve other people. Are we willing to get out of our comfort zone and serve? I hope that is the case. The people in Matthew 25, they were willing to do that. The third thing we see here is that I've got to treat people as if they represent Jesus. That's what they did here in this parable. And when they made simple decisions to show love for their own fellow man. Isn't that what Jesus told us to do in John chapter 13, verses 34 and 35? He's been instructing his disciples about his coming death and betrayal. And he makes this statement in verse 34, the marker of a disciple is that you love people as Christ loves people. You know, before in the law, it was love your neighbor as yourself. That's a challenge, but that's easier for me to apply than loving people as Jesus loved people. You think about the illustration of Jesus in working with people who weren't as well liked and accepted, touching a leper, with the prostitutes and the tax collectors, the religious leaders. They would come to Jesus and they would say, why are you doing this? And why are your disciples or associating with unclean people? Do we love people the same way Jesus loves people? I hope that's true of us in the church in the 21st century. I know that I personally can do a better job with this, and I serve others as if they represent Jesus himself, because we learn that from this parable. That's the principle that's repeated at least 2 different times. And let's not miss the judgment scene. Are we motivated by judgment? You know, we look at the scenario that's presented here by Christ, and there they stand before the judgment seat of Christ, and they're giving account for themselves. And then notice he says, you know, one righteous inherits eternal life, the other inherits eternal punishment. Are we motivated by judgment? That's not necessarily a bad thing, to be motivated by judgment. Paul says, knowing the fear of the Lord, we persuade men. In the last part of 1 Corinthians 15, that great resurrection chapter, have you ever noticed how Paul ends that chapter? Therefore be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord. Our service to our fellow man must abound. It must overflow from a love for God, a love for Christ, a love for people. And that's what's illustrated here by the righteous. One last thing I want you to notice from this parable, and then we'll conclude, and our lesson will be yours. I want you to notice something here, how many times Jesus repeats the first person personal pronoun. I was sick, and you helped me. I needed food, and you helped me. I was in prison and you helped me. Do we understand that acts of service is personal to Jesus? It's personal to him. He wants his people to be his hands and his feet. The question I have for you, church, is it personal to you?
Sing praise.